All right, so you ready to dive deep into some music production secrets? We're talking about making music that's truly epic, the kind that gives you chills.
Yeah, like the soundtracks to those huge blockbuster films or
Hmm.
those immersive video games.
Exactly. And lucky for us, we've got this awesome guide, 101 Music Production Tips by Arn Total. He's a composer and producer who's worked on some pretty amazing projects.
What I really like about this guide is it's not just about like the technical stuff. It actually digs into the creative process as well,
Mm.
which is super helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And he kicks things off talking about composing for epicness, which is a pretty fitting place to start, right?
Totally. And one of the first things he talks about is this concept of growth, but he's not just talking about cranking the volume up.
So what does it mean by growth then?
Well, it's more about building complexity. So
Yeah.
like as your music progresses, you want to add layers, introduce new instruments, and really evolve that soundscape.
Hmm.
It's all about keeping the listener engaged.
Ah, I see. So it's like taking the listener on a journey, sort of.
Exactly. And speaking of keeping things interesting, he has this really cool tip about switching to a higher key right at the climax of the piece.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but he explains how it creates this really powerful emotional response.
It's all about playing with expectations. We're so used to music resolving downwards. So when it goes up at that intense moment, it really grabs your attention.
I love how he uses real world examples to illustrate his points too. Like that time he challenged himself to write a hit track using only four chords and a single repeating note.
Right. And it ended up being one of his most popular pieces. It
Yeah.
just shows how limitations can sometimes spark creativity.
Yeah.
Sometimes having too many choices can actually be a bad thing.
That's so true. It's like having a blank canvas that's way too big. You wouldn't even know where to start.
Exactly. By
Mm.
giving himself those constraints, he had to think outside the box. And that's how he came up with something so unique.
Speaking of inspiration, he also talks about using visuals as a starting point, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, it's a great way to tap into a different part of your brain. Instead of starting with notes, you start with a mood, a feeling, maybe even a scene from a movie.
Hmm.
It can lead to some pretty unexpected musical choices.
I bet. Like you're almost scoring that scene in your head. And speaking of movies, he's got this three levels rule for composing trailer music that I thought was super helpful.
Oh yeah, that's a classic. Intro, build, climax.
Uh-huh.
It's a simple structure, but it's so effective at building tension and release, keeping the listener hooked.
And that whole tension release thing is so crucial in any kind of storytelling, whether it's music, movies, books. It's what keeps us engaged.
Absolutely. And when it comes to actually creating those melodies, he really stresses the importance of balance.
He talks about balancing those big dramatic leaps with smaller stepwise movements,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. It's like a good conversation.
Yeah.
You need a mix of those highs and lows, moments of excitement, and pauses to keep things interesting. If it's all big leaks, it can be overwhelming.
So it's like finding that sweet spot between keeping things exciting but making sure the listener doesn't get lost.
Exactly. And once you have those strong melodies, it's time to start thinking about orchestration.
And that's where things can get really epic. But how do you make sure your melodies don't get buried in the mix?
Well, Arne talks about using tone, color, rhythm, and range to differentiate your melodies.
So, like giving each melody its own distinct character, almost like giving them their own voices.
Yes. If everything blends together, it can be tiring for the listener and you lose that impact. It's all about clarity.
He gives some really cool examples of how to do this too.
Yeah, like combining flotando strings, those light, airy strings with male voices humming underneath, for example.
Hmm.
It creates this really beautiful ethereal texture.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Or how about pairing harp with pizzicato strings?
Exactly. Doubling the harp with pizzicato strings gives you that warm, plucked sound, which is really inviting.
It's amazing how much emotion and atmosphere you can create just by choosing the right combination of instruments.
It really is. And that's why understanding the strengths and limitations of each instrument family is so crucial. You need to know what each instrument can do and how to use them effectively.
It's like having the right tools for the job, right?
Exactly. And sometimes it's the simplest things that can make a big difference. Like he even reminds us about something that often gets overlooked in MIDI production,
What's that?
remembering that your brass and woodwind players need to breathe.
Oh, yeah. It's easy to forget when you're programming those parts, but giving them space to breathe makes it sound so much more realistic.
It's those little details that add a touch of humanness to the music.
For sure. And speaking of making things sound huge, he has a great tip for those big string
Oh
sections.
yeah. Doubling your string melodies in octaves. It instantly makes them sound massive and gives them that cinematic quality.
All right, so we've covered composing for epicness and bringing those melodies to life with orchestration. I'm ready to hear about some of those production power moves he mentions.
Me too. Let's jump into the next section and see what kind of sonic magic we can conjure up. All right, so let's talk production. This is where we really bring those epic compositions to life.
Yeah, Arn's got some really interesting techniques in this section. The one that caught my eye was adding a sub bass to those big, powerful moments in the track.
Oh, yeah. It's all about that visceral impact,
What?
that feeling you get in your chest when you hear a truly massive sound.
So it's not just what we hear, but what we feel as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of adding layers, he talks about this cool technique called parallel compression on drums.
That one sounded kind of technical, but I think I get the idea. You're using two versions of the drum track, right?
Right. One version is heavily compressed to give you that punch and attack, and then the other is left more natural to keep some of the original dynamics.
So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds, punchy and natural all at the same time.
Exactly. It's a clever way to strike that balance. Now, when it comes to mixing funner, Arn's a big advocate for using reference tracks.
He calls them a roadmap for your sound, right?
Yeah. It's like having a professionally mixed track in the same genre as yours, so you can compare and see where you might need to make adjustments.
Like having a guide to help you along the way. And speaking of listening, he has this quirky tip about actually stepping outside your studio and listening to the mix from behind a closed door.
I know it sounds weird, but it makes sense. When you're in the studio for hours, your ears get tired and you might miss subtle things.
Ah, so it's like tricking your ears into hearing things fresh.
Exactly. It can be surprisingly effective. Another technique he talks about is automating things like velocity and modulation in your MIDI recordings.
Oh, yeah, I love that one. It really brings those virtual instruments to life.
Absolutely. Those subtle variations in volume and tone, they make it sound so much more realistic and expressive.
All right, so we've covered composing, orchestrating, and now production. What's next on Arn's list for creating epic music?
Well, now it's all about making sure that all this hard work sounds amazing no matter where people are listening. It's time to polish that final sound.
I'm all ears. What are Arn's secrets for taking our tracks to the next level?
This is where we fine-tune those mixes and make sure they translate well across different listening environments.
And he starts by talking about the spatial element of the mix, right?
Right. Panning instruments like they would be positioned on a stage creates a wider, more immersive sound.
So instead of everything being crammed in the middle, it's like you're creating a sonic landscape.
Exactly. It's about using that stereo field to add depth. And of course, he reminds us to listen to our mixes on multiple systems.
The car test, the laptop speakers, the headphones, got to make sure it sounds good everywhere.
Absolutely. And for those who love that warm analog sound, he's got a tip for adding that special something.
Let me guess, two BQs and compressors?
You got it. There's just something about those analog circuits that adds a richness and warmth that's hard to replicate digitally.
It's like giving your music a vintage vibe, even if it's brand new. And finally, Arn shares a piece of advice that I think we all need to hear.
Oh yeah, the importance of fresh ears. Don't try to do everything at once. Mix, master, and release all in one go.
It's so tempting to just keep going, but taking a break can make a world of difference.
It's like looking at a painting with fresh eyes. You suddenly see things you didn't notice before.
So we've covered composing, orchestrating, producing, and now polishing. It's been quite the journey through Arn's world of music production.
It has. He really packs a punch with this guide. What are your biggest takeaways? What really resonated with you?
For me, it's that balance he strikes between those big picture ideas and the little nitty-gritty details. Like, yeah, changing to a higher key at the climax, that's huge. But then there's stuff like remembering that your brass players need to breathe.
All those things together that really make the music special.
Right.
You need that grand vision, but you also need that attention to detail.
It's like those epic movie scores. You've got those soaring themes, but then there are these tiny, subtle sounds that just add so much depth.
And Arn clearly understands both sides. He's not just a composer, he's also a producer. So he knows how to take those ideas and turn them into a polished, finished product.
It's that combination of artistry and technical skill that makes this guide so useful, I think. It's not just telling you what to do, it's explaining the why behind it.
And that's how you really learn. When you understand the why, you can start applying those ideas to your own music.
Yeah.
You can develop your own style.
So for everyone listening out there, what are you going to take away from all this? What kind of epic music are you going to create?
Think about it. What emotions do you want to evoke? What story are you trying to tell? What kind of soundscape are you going to build?
Don't be afraid to get creative. Try out those crazy instrument combinations. Experiment with the production techniques. Who knows? Maybe you'll discover the next big thing in epic music.
And most importantly, have fun with it. Making music should be an adventure.
That's the best advice. So go out there and make something epic.